All right, we're buffering for our YouTube stream. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending the final day of the Dismantle Preservation Unconference. It has been such a delight to coordinate this year's event. You may have noticed, but the vast majority, or all of our speakers actually, have been students, recent graduates, or grassroots activists. It was really intentional to highlight the voices of people who you may not typically get to hear speak at a traditional preservation conference. And it was also intentional to encourage our speakers to present on topics of what they're working on, how they see the future of preservation. And I hope all of you are being as inspired as I am by the work that's being showcased and the food for thought that we're being given. I am also pleased that this event has been free for all of you. So thank you for attending. And while it's a free event, thanks to the generous support of the Alphawood Foundation, Museum Hack, and Eileen and Norman Tyler, we are encouraging you to support the nonprofits and fundraisers that you're learning about this week. They may be a fundraiser or nonprofit mentioned in a talk, or it may be one of the 5 pre-selected nonprofits that you've been learning about in the emails from me. And these are Latinos in Heritage Conservation, Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, the Decay Devils, House of Tulip, and the Apache Pasha Project. Each of these endeavors are pushing preservation in new directions, and they deserve our support. If you're able to, please give a donation, but even if you're not, you can support them by following them on social media, signing up for their newsletters, or just sharing information about these groups with your friends. It's really important that we support people who are challenging the constructs of the preservation movement and who are proactively working toward positive change. And I'm really excited for the conversation we're about to have today. I'm joking that it's lessons in mindfulness, but I'm sure we're going to be given lots of food for thought on specific ways that we can encourage conversations in our communities and amongst our peers through our talks. So these are going to be back-to-back presentations followed by a Q&A. You're encouraged to share your thoughts and questions in the chat or throw questions in the Q&A box as well. And if you'd like, share your feelings on social media with hashtag Dismantle Preservation. And I'm going to pass the mic to Anne.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. Waiting for this to come up. All right, can everybody see that? I'm hoping yes. Hi, my name is Ann Chance, and my presentation is about how personal values impact inclusion in interpretation and management on heritage sites. This doesn't seem to be moving. Oh, there we go. My initial project is in 2020 was about how cultural competency, cultural sensitivity, and human-centered programming was perceived by site managers and directors and implemented at heritage sites. I conducted 7 interviews with 6 people at 6 different heritage sites regarding their views about their job, the site, and implementation of heritage education and how these related to my subject of interest. Learned a great deal about differences in implementation and causes, but there were things about how participants framed their conversation, words they used, specific comments made, and attitudes that stayed with me and made me curious. What was it that I was perceiving and how can it be studied? I decided to research methods of parsing meaning beyond the superficial values of words and revisit my interviews. My approach was to find theoretical explanations for what seemed to be hidden and unconscious barriers. There were things I could sense participants found important. For example, quite a few were concerned for this central story. Comments like, people are going to be so focused on telling the undertold stories, they don't tell all the stories. And so that's what I hope, the push is for inclusivity, but not at the expense of losing everybody's stories, because then you would be doing the opposite. I recognized that the story they're afraid would be lost is Laura Jane Smith's authorized heritage discourse. But I was intuiting something deeper, internalized, and operating to reinforce the authorized heritage discourse. We discuss heritage values, but have we examined the values of those appointed to be an authority on how heritage is framed, implemented, and enacted? Will this explain, or at least illuminate, some of the structural impediments or acceptance of inclusivity? I chose critical discourse analysis to ground my methodology. I subscribe to and frame my analysis by the work of James G. I interpret G, or as I interpret G, I look at what the people are trying to say beyond what they're saying. For example, one of my participants discusses telegraphing. The fact that they use this word tells me something about them, which I'll demonstrate in just a bit. I also chose G's work because of his focus on non-vernacular language, the language of professionals, like those in the heritage preservation field, to understand how to read the lexicon of the profession. But I wanted to take it further. I need a way to articulate perceptions within a valid, evidence-based array of descriptors. I found this in Shalom Shwartz's work on personal values. Shwartz broke down values that covered a wide array of refined definitions. So, for example, the value face, which we find straddling the super values of self-enhancement and conservation, expresses security and power through maintaining one's public image and avoiding humiliation. The super values it straddles are rooted in anxiety. They seek to prevent loss and are a means of self-protection. So going back to telegraphing, the participant mentions this in a derogatory sense regarding sites that act reactively to current calls for inclusivity, who appear to be pandering to public opinion. Well, this reveals that the participant is very much aware and protective of the perceived image of the organization, and that it conforms to their idea of what is appropriate. So, for example, this was coded under the category of face. My sample included 6 people, all white, all well-educated, in management positions and from a variety of heritage sites. All of the interviews were coded and given a score of 1 each time a value was assigned. The most narrowly defined values were used to code, but can also be aggregated by more broadly inclusive values. Then I produced a chart to see how they compared. I also broke out comparisons by higher order values. Power is one area that stood out. Male discourse drew heavily on power themes. Women's discourse on power was almost non-existent. This might mean that women would score higher in the opposite vector, which was universalism. The universalism vector where women scored higher than men was tolerance, which expresses acceptance and understanding of those who are different from oneself. But we also consider meaning in those vectors which lie side by side on the chart. In this chart, I compare power and achievement. There's a clear oppositional read between the values of achievement and power, and they appear inversely correlated between men and women. I created these wheels and based on how they scored. And looking at these wheels, Kathy's values fall under the superordinate value social focus, but straddle the ordinate values self-transcendence and conservation. Kathy scores high in universal concern, which is an external concern, and benevolence caring, which is about your in-group. This could be interpreted as her understanding the need to see things from multiple perspectives and fight for social justice. And by using these, she connects various community identities. Mary demonstrates many of the same values as Kathy, weighted toward the social focus ordinate values of self-transcendence and conservation. The most striking difference is that where Kathy's values include openness to change, Mary's wheel includes a further conservation value, safety, personal, which tips her values to include some anxiety avoidance. We ID'd Mary as a company or in-group sympathizer. Gia, who is the youngest of my participants, her value scores appear broadly dispersed across the values, with the notable exception of a high concentration in tolerance and concern. Gia believes her management provides community context for what's going on in the present. It helps us to understand who we are and why we are the way we are. And she says, it's important to approach history from a variety of different perspectives, because if you are looking at one group's account of events, you aren't getting the full story. In other words, it provides the in-group with meaning to better understand itself and those who they serve. Where G is the youngest participant, Mike is the oldest. Mike is deeply tied to his site and struggles to address change while preserving the status quo. His scores are broadly dispersed across values denoting conservation and self-enhancement. His highest scores reflect a personal focus that outweighs his self-transcendence vectors. But when social vectors emerge, the theme of ethno-territoriality presents itself. Mike argues that to include more voices would detract from telling the whole story or appealing to a broader audience. This gives us clues as to who is in Mike's in-group. His statements indicate that something gets muddled through inclusivity. Mike's value concentration and benevolence caring and benevolence dependability demands that he conforms the group included on the site to a particular perspective. Harry's scores are weighted in the ordinate values of self-transcendence and openness to change. These straddle the superordinate values of social focus and personal focus, suggesting a balance. These superordinate values comprise the overarching value of growth and freedom from anxiety. Harry's in-group is all-inclusive, and he makes that a priority in the management of his site. Like Mike, Chip also demonstrates a type of ethno-territoriality. While Chip shows some variety, it appears his values skew towards conservation and self-enhancement, with limited priorities in universal values or openness to change. More broadly, the distribution falls under the meta value of the self-protection, anxiety avoidance paradigm. However, the way Chip's values interact across the continuum is critical. Chip mirrors Mike in his aversion to universal values and his loyalty to a specific in-group. Acts of inclusivity are presented as pandering to identity groups, resulting in a loss of face among the perceived in-group. There is a fear of losing stories that were traditionally told, and that inclusivity should not be at the expense of losing everybody's stories. So what conclusions can I draw? Well, first, using Shwartz's theory of values is a viable way to ground and articulate the critical discourse analysis. It's grounded in iterative studies, the most recent article being published this year. The definitions of the values are clear, and there is no overlap between values. I can infer no conclusions about the population represented here. However, the study does suggest areas that require future research. One is, what power differentials exist between men and women in the industry? Another might be to determine which values might produce more inclusive sites. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Really appreciate that food for thought. We're now going to move on to Carolyn, and following Carolyn's presentation, we'll have a Q&A where both speakers will be able to answer your questions.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Anne. Hi, my name is Carolyn Levine, and I am so honored to be presenting here today as part of the 2021 Dismantle Preservation Unconference. To set some context, I graduated in May 2021, just a few months ago, with a Master of Science in Urban Placemaking and Management from Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And the work I'm presenting today is part of my graduate thesis research. So Beyond Trauma, a healing-centered framework for urban planning and adjacent fields. And let's get started. So urban planning is a profession that at its essence is about change. Urban planners change the built environment through technical and political processes. And change at any scale, and whether anticipated or not, is hard for humans to process. We know this intrinsically, but there are some theories that support it as well. Attachment theory states that people seek relationships, environments, and experiences that provide emotional and social security. The conservative impulse is the desire to hold on to the past, which guarantees a level of continuity. And humans generally just really need and like having a sense of routine. And the current planning paradigm does not account for the emotional processing required when people are confronted with change because of its roots in the sciences and engineering, which value rational thought over emotional feedback. Contemporary planning is more concerned with quantitative data and outcomes than the human experience and emotional response to change. And this goes all the way back to the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, through the Industrial Revolution and today. And while I personally want an engineer to be involved in the building of physical infrastructure, urban planning is more than the built environment. It's community, it's neighborhoods, connection, belonging, sensory and emotional experiences. And the prevailing paradigm, known as the rational model of planning, begins by defining the problem, identifying alternatives, evaluating those alternatives, implementing them, monitoring them, and so on and so forth in a feedback loop. The model looks pretty similar to the scientific method, and nowhere in any of these models is there room to account for the emotional and psychological repercussions of altering the built environment and consequently people's routines. And this is known as the emotional paradox of planning, and it often shows up in the community engagement process. So this Parks and Rec meme hits the nail on the head. Leslie Knope is saying, "So what I hear when I'm being yelled at is people carrying loudly at me." And while it's a good joke, it's also very accurate. People are having a natural emotional response to a proposed change, but the current planning paradigm doesn't account for that. And in many instances, there is real trauma that needs to be addressed, such as in the aftermath of a severe weather event like a fire, a police brutality. Each of these events leaves a mark on a community, creating collective traumas. In these instances, there is a real case to be made for an emotionally engaged planning paradigm. So to address collective and individual traumas, as well as to accommodate natural human emotional reactions to change, I'm proposing a new framework for urban planning, one that centers emotional well-being and healing for both individuals and communities. And in my thesis, I illustrated how this framework can be applied to professional practice by using the case study of the Inner Loop North planning study in Rochester, New York. To set some context, the top photo is downtown Rochester in 1951 and then again in 2014, decades after the Inner Loop was constructed. And you can see the highway that encircles downtown. It creates this noose around the central business district and cuts downtown off from the surrounding neighborhoods. So what happened in Rochester is representative of the typical development pattern of North American cities during the middle of the 20th century. Like many of its contemporaries, Rochester received federal funding in the 1950s and 60s to build a highway through its urban core. This period of federal policy is known as urban renewal. Between 1949 and 1973, through various pieces of legislation, the U.S. government bulldozed 2,500 neighborhoods in 933 American cities, displacing 1 million people. In Rochester, more than 1,700 people were displaced during urban renewal, including those displaced by the Inner Loop construction. And it's important to note that this reclamation of land and resources is as American as apple pie, beginning with the forced removal and genocide of the indigenous population after European contact, the theft and enslavement of human beings from up and down the West African coast, the forced internment of Japanese Americans, bulldozing Latinx neighborhoods in LA to build Dodger Stadium, to contemporary pipelines through sacred land. So dispossession is standard operating procedure in North America. But there's been a significant cultural shift in the way that we understand and speak about specifically urban highways over the last few years. In early 2021, the Biden administration and Transportation Secretary Buttigieg made a vocal commitment to address the racist legacy of the urban highway system, including a $20 billion investment to reconnect urban neighborhoods that were cut off by highways. So there's a huge opportunity based on the current political environment to apply a healing-centered lens to planning studies and projects that involve highway removal, because there is a real trauma to heal, both physical and psychological. So because of this recognition of the harms inflicted by urban highways and the cost of the maintenance, cities are beginning to reimagine what they can look like without these highways. And Rochester is leading the way on this trend, filling in a portion of the Inner Loop in 2014. The former sunken highway is now a human-scale boulevard with protected cycle track and hundreds of new units of housing. In early 2020, the city began studying the northern section of the highway, which is what I focus on for my thesis. And you can see the section here in the blue box. As part of my methodology for this research, I took part in the overall planning study as a member of the Community Advisory Committee, and I conducted semi-formal interviews with residents and stakeholders. So common themes among all the interviewees were a considerable lack of trust between residents and the city and consultants, residual pain from losing their homes and social connections when the highway was built, and then an unyielding hope that this project would be different and would create opportunity for the neighborhood to serve the needs of all of its residents. In my conversation with an active member of the community who happens to be a nurse by training, we discussed the emotional toll of the highway. And while she's too young to have been directly impacted by the highway, many members of her church were children when the highway was built. And so she relayed to me that when talking with them about the highway, you can still hear the pain this many years later. And in her words, and I agree, that says a lot. So when I suggested a more therapeutic approach to the planning process using language from the research I had conducted up to that point, she made a connection between her trauma-informed approach as a nurse. And I wasn't familiar with trauma-informed care, but her comment led me down a rabbit hole to find out A, what trauma-informed care is, and B, whether it had or could be applied to urban planning. And so what I found is a lot. I looked at various models of trauma-informed care across the human services sector and found that there are generally 5 to 6 guiding principles, depending on the source. You don't need to be a clinician to practice this approach. It's about being mindful and intentional about our everyday interactions with other people who very likely have a history of trauma. It's a holistic approach to care that recognizes systems of power and privilege. I also found at least 6 reports and guides that have been published in the last few years that discuss human-centered approaches to community development, housing, and architecture. However, there was nothing in the planning literature. And I couldn't help but wonder, if other fields are utilizing this approach, why isn't planning? So I took the guiding principles and best practices I had read about and adapted them into a new framework, the ABCs of healing-centered planning: agency, belonging, culture, and safety. Agency emphasizes empowerment, choice, control, and ownership. It's grounded in the understanding that education and capacity building lead to more informed decision-making, and that individuals and communities are the best equipped to make decisions for themselves. Belonging is the feeling of security and support when there is a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity for a member of a group. When someone feels a sense of belonging, they are able to bring their full self to the table. And this principle is grounded in the understanding that social connections are the most valuable form of infrastructure in a community. It emphasizes collaboration and shared power. Culture is an assets-based principle that honors culture and identity and nurtures imagination and hope. It emphasizes decision-making in alignment with community priorities and values diverse perspectives. And then safety is the foundation of everything else. It prioritizes physical and emotional safety, including trustworthiness and respect. So using the ABCs as guiding principles, maybe we can accomplish what one of the interviewees said so well: some healing before we even go into planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate both of your talks a lot. For our audience, if you're having any questions for our speakers, please throw them into the Q&A or the chat. So I feel like I said, these are lessons in mindfulness, and it's interesting to hear, Anne's perspective of how this is why we view things this way. This is how our thought processes may be different multi-generationally. So I'm kind of wondering, from both of your work, what do you think some key first steps are for a preservation nonprofit or a state historic preservation office? If you got to go in and be the boss of one of those groups, looking at this work that you've done, what would your first way to implement it or to help shift the mindset in your organizations be?
I'll go first, Carolyn, if that's okay. I would want to interview who is there. I would interview the board as well. I would want to hear their perceptions of what they think the site should be. Because a lot of times, the whole ideology behind the site begins there. And if the board is a certain way, you're probably not going to change it. One of the things that Harry, one of my interviews, had was a very open-minded board, and they brought him in knowing how open-minded he was, and he made phenomenal changes on his site. Mike, on the other hand, had volunteered at the site since he was a child, and his father had been on the board, and he basically grew up with the site. And my colleague and I basically identified that he had so internalized the in-group of the site, he didn't even know when he was establishing an ethno-territorial site rather than an inclusive site. Does that make sense?
And I'll say, I think it just really comes down to a culture change, a culture shift, which is obviously not something you can just kind of do overnight. In my thesis, I outlined some recommendations. One of them is updating planning curriculum. One of the things I found in my research is that planning methods classes, which are, kind of like in your first semester of planning school, pretty standard, they really don't, they focus on data collection and all these other quantitative methodologies, but they are completely divorced from the full human experience when they discount the impact of human emotion or human experience on these changes in the built environment. So I think it starts in school with students and creating a more diverse experience in the classroom and valuing more ways of learning and more ways of understanding, and understanding that stories and experiences, that's also data. So using that to inform your plans and your decisions, just giving that a higher value and making sure that students understand, the full human experience.
Thank you. And there's someone wanting you to expound a bit about what AHD is. What does the acronym even mean? And can you just explain that concept to us for a second?
So AHD is the authorized heritage discourse, and that's like what we accept, right, as this is the main story. And essentially what that is the settler colonial discourse, and is central. That's central. Everything else is ancillary to that. So the focus is always on that central discourse, and all the marginalized stories are still just kind of accoutrements to that story.
We have a great question from Cynthia for both of you. Does some of the traditional planning methods reflect having more men than women involved in the process? Much of your approaches, emotion, power sharing, etc., reflect what would be interpreted as characters found in a woman's versus men's approach.
I think so. In a lot of my conversations during my research, it was, pointed out to me, and also was just kind of aware that it's a kind of feminist approach to planning. And so, yes, I think so. If somebody wants to write their thesis on that, I'd love to read it. But yeah.
I think what they are implying, though, Carolyn, is that's a feminine approach. Do you know what I mean? Rather than as feminist, the feminist approach looks at all standpoints, not just women's. And for me, the difference between power and achievement, my interpretation of that was men have the power, so women compensate for that by achieving more. That's where they're getting their power from. And I almost feel that myself. I feel like I have to do better than everyone else just to be considered for a position, just to be considered for a position against a man.
And I will say to the audience, if you're looking to explore women urban planning movement, look at Katrina Johnston Zimmerman. I'll throw her name in the chat. She actually was recognized by the BBC in 2019, named one of their 100 women in the world making change for her work to create a women-centered planning approach. So I'd highly recommend looking into her. Raina wants to know, Carolyn. She is curious to hear your thoughts about how to conduct any type of trauma-informed planning process when the community has been displaced and no longer is present. How to give them a voice, but also recognize a lot of planning centering political power of the people that live there now.
That's a really good question, and I don't have an answer to that. I will say in one of my studios in school, that was something that we discussed. We were working on a project in the Rockaways in New York, and a lot of the conversation there is about, preserving a community that is threatened by climate change and sea level rise, and how do you have these really sensitive conversations with people whose homes and communities are, being threatened by external forces. And yeah, so I would say I don't have a good answer for that. I think this is a really great opportunity for planners and preservationists to work across disciplines. So working with, people who have more of a background in this, either in, psychology or social work, people that work in human services. This is a really great way to kind of expand our knowledge individually, and then also just use the strengths of other people who have specialties that we don't as planners and preservationists. So I'll just refer to my thesis again. That was one of my recommendations, is using this transdisciplinary approach to make sure that we're hearing from and learning from people who are experts in things that we are not.
So both of you have been kind of exploring emotions through the work that you've been doing. So for you, Carolyn, how has this been received when you were working through your thesis, whether it's the Rochester community or your fellow students or professors? And then for Anne, I know you have been interviewing so many people for your research, especially as you work toward the start of your dissertation. How are people responding to these ideas and these encouragements to shift our entire way we interact with others, essentially?
I'll go first with that one. I'll say my research was really well received by my advisors and professors. I think that we're all kind of ready to have a little bit more of these, I guess, deeper conversations, especially, I would say, because half of my graduate school experience was virtual, of course, thanks to COVID. So, we've all kind of had this upheaval of our lives in the last year and a half. And so there's just a recognition that the status quo is not sufficient. And so, at least in my conversations, people were really enthusiastic and encouraged to try and find different ways of, finding solutions to some of the big problems that we're facing.
For me, it was Laura Jane Smith's book, Emotional Heritage, that I was reading. My dissertation is in international conflict management and peace building and development, which I thought would be a great tie-in with heritage preservation. When I read Laura Jane Smith's, everything about the authorized heritage discourse, I realized that this is what I was hearing as pushback. So that's what really got me interested, because you could hear people's hesitancy to want to be completely inclusive, that they were afraid that they were going to be losing something. And you see that with some of the conflicts that surround heritage, right? They think by giving space to other people, ethno-territoriality, by giving space to other people, that they lose space themselves. And so I thought, my thinking is that there has to be a way to demonstrate to people that by giving space to other people, you get more space, not less.
Oh, thank you both so much. I think this is a good note to end on. But I will selfishly plug, next year, as part of the Dismantle Preservation's in-person learning labs, we'll be visiting Old Salem Museum and Gardens in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which has been one of the oldest preservation establishments in the country. And we're actually going to have a immersive learning experience under Frank Bagnon, where we will be spending a day with him learning how he has, like Anne referenced, countered people's perception that if you expand the narrative, you will lose donors, you will lose visitors, because Frank is completely reimagining the institution. And then for Carolyn, I will say, if you want to learn more about this Rochester Highway project, the New York Preservation Conference had a rousing discussion as a part of their conference last year in 2020. So reach out to the Western Landmark Society of New York and see if you can get your hands on a recording of that conversation to hear how the city has partnered with local grassroots activists to work toward healing. So it's wonderful for Carolyn to have given us some background and to piqued our interest into that very much ongoing project. Thank you both so much for being here and for our audience for sharing the space with us. Really appreciate you all wanting to develop your mindfulness.